Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're starting our SAGE Digest today. Um, we had recently our SAGE meeting. It was a very, very good meeting. I know that a lot of you were able to attend virtually, and some of us were able to attend in person. And it was 2 weeks ago, and it addressed very important topics. I know that you're looking forward to it. Included pneumococcal vaccines, mpox, polio, and varicella containing vaccines. Uh, Also, importantly for us, SAGE emphasized the importance of country decision making, and we updated the progress on NITACs and prioritization of new vaccines introduction, which I think is going to be very important in the near future for all of us. Also, SAGE shared its concerns on the current global context of with investment on immunization, which I think is going to be also something important to look forward for us. So for the highlights on the SAGE meeting, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah, our SAGE chair. Go ahead, Hannah. Really nice to see you again and to talk to you.
Thanks a lot, Mario, and regards to everybody from Rio, where the Global Vaccines and Immunization Research Forum is actually meeting right now. Can we go to the next slide? So here you can see what Mario was already saying. This was the agenda that we tackled during our last SAGE meeting 2 weeks ago. And the highlights have already been published on the SAGE website so that you can look into in writing in there. And the actual deliberations will come in the weekly epidemiological record early June. Next slide, please. So first, let's go to the global and regional reports. And Kate O'Brien was alerting us to the historic changes that both in the domestic and priorities with major threats for the health programs are ahead of us. As you have all read in the newspapers, there are major cuts in budgets when it comes to aid, but also when it comes to health and social welfare in individual countries. And this, of course, will be impacting us in the immunization world. I want to alert you to there's with the small writing here, there's a link to the Lancet. There is a commentary that SAGE members and Right Act chairs wrote on our concern that we need to safeguard immunization. And as we know that the WHO will need to reduce its budget and reorganize its work, we in SAGE really wanted to flag that when it comes to the normative functions that the WHO is working on evidence-based decision and recommendations. This is very sorely needed by the low, middle, and high-income countries in this world, and this is an area where we hope that there is enough wisdom among the member states when they discuss the restructuring of the WHO functions. Next slide, please. So if we look into the essential program on immunization in 2025 and into its next 50 years, countries really are in the driver's seat. And I think that these funding cuts will also enforce that countries need to take responsibility, which has then reflected in the design of the national immunization strategy and allocating resources and using them efficiently, as also stated in the Lusaka agenda. So there needs to be political leadership. Countries need to prioritize and make decisions on which vaccines they will introduce and which how they optimize targeting the different risk groups. And also there is a call for regional manufacturing so that regions and countries are more self-sufficient in this volatile world. We looked into the structure and the scope and the context of the life course immunization through primary healthcare is high on the agenda. There are new vaccines and delivery technologies coming. And then again, we need to see on how we can develop our national programs, how we can introduce new vaccines, and how we can also take into consideration what is lying ahead of us through the climate change, as well as through the technological advancements in digitalization and AI, which will all help us to be more resilient and more creative, hopefully in the future. And then it was pointed out that there still is problems with the humanitarian settings in the crisis, and there needs to be commitment to equity and sustainability, because we cannot just be reacting to outbreaks and doing campaigns. We need to see on how we can make the routine immunization work better, so that we reach everybody and everyone, regardless of where these people live. Next slide, please. So in the report on the immunization and vaccines and biologicals director, these are the highlights. The report underscored the progress and impact made in global immunization, while acknowledging the significant challenges ahead, as I just pointed out. And also that the role of WHO across the immunization value chain was detailed, meaning that there will be acceleration of the introduction of the TB vaccines. There will be scaling up malaria and human papillomavirus vaccination. There is a strong move to make the regulatory processes more competent, and the regionalization of the vaccine manufacturing, so that regions are more self-sufficient and not reliant on higher income countries manufacturing solely. SAGE did express a deep concern about the diversion of resources away from public health and the consequent threats to global immunization programs, in particular the sudden discontinuation of funding. And this is what we are also alerting in our letter, in the commentary in the Lancet. It's true that processes can always be improved and streamlined, but these kind of sudden discontinuations really are a major threat, as you have read yesterday, that Gavi funding also will be cut by the US. So there are major challenges ahead. The financial constraints are not getting any easier. There is misinformation, there are geopolitical shifts, and the health system strains pose risk to preserving gains, and to have continued success means that we need to be very resilient and creative here. WHO aims to support countries in building resilient, equitable, and sustainable immunization programs for the next 50 years and beyond through strategic prioritization, innovation, and global collaboration. And here we need to put our wise heads together and also talk to the different stakeholders, including our ministers, so that we can actually keep that good pace and make use of the technologies that provide us with better tools. Next slide, please. So then SAGE heard the regional reports. There were 3 regional reports that highlighted the surgence of measles and the need for urgent actions to mitigate the risk of large outbreaks, while noting the challenges with improving routine coverage and timely preventive vaccination activities. The problems could be further exacerbated with the shift in the resources away from health to fund other priorities. So this is something we really need to be on guard. The number of zero-dose children has unfortunately increased in some regions even after the restoration of the routine immunization programs following the COVID pandemic response. And while the big catch-up has helped indeed, it has only partially addressed the problem, and further efforts are required to fill immunity gaps. The report from the Southeast Asia region struck a positive note, and they reported on the successes with scaling up HPV vaccination. And SAGE recommendations for the use of a single dose schedule have actually made a big difference, an important contribution to scale up the HPV program. Next slide, please. So moving on to the IA 2030, we had a very rich session on looking into the national strategies and conclusions. And through many countries, though they remain off track against key metrics for measuring progress against the IA 2030 indicators, there have been notable achievements also, such as the big catch-up and the scale-up of malaria and HPV vaccination. The review of 51 national immunization strategy documents from low-middle-income countries show that countries are setting specific targets to reach IA 2030 goals. And the linkages to public health, primary healthcare have been strengthened, and the national immunization strategies have been utilized for advocacy and resource mobilization to secure political commitment and adequate funding for immunization programs. The immunization data systems in many countries, they lack, unfortunately, granularity and context and nuance and discernments to inform actions required to improve program performance. So this is an area that we need to do better. We need to be sure that the data systems are such that local performers and decision makers can have better use, that they can guide better in their activities. Country-centered, continuously quality improved processes supported by sufficiently capacitated WHO regional offices are required to enable the required changes in program monitoring. And this is work that needs analytic thinking and also country and region contributions to establish that kind of dialogue on how we can do better with the resources that will be even more limited from here on, so that we can best use on what we have at hand. Next slide, please. So now I turn it over to the Secretariat, Joachim Hombach, who will take us through the prioritization of the new vaccine introductions and MPOX. And I'll leave you here, and I need to dive back into the immunization meeting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So you have seen that one major theme at the SAGE meeting was essentially around country-led decision-making. You have seen it already also from the previous session on IA 2030, that there was a lot of discussion on data, a lot of discussion on making sure that country generate the necessary data and for action in the local context in relation to their program performance. Kind of flowing from that was a discussion on the prioritization of new vaccine introduction. And obviously, the stage has already been set in terms of obviously the recognition that we are regretfully moving in areas where we have reduced fiscal space, but on the other hand side, we also have more and more vaccine options, which is great, but it forces country, and I think of every income level, to consider actually what are the vaccines of priority for their country, which are those, or what is the sequence of introduction, or what are the vaccines that you actually don't want to introduce. And so in this context, there is tools that have been developed, and these are tools which are multi-criteria decision analysis tools, where you basically, in a structured way, move through a very large array of criteria that you have predefined, and give values to these different criteria, so that there is a transparent, evidence-informed process by stakeholders in order to come to a prioritization of vaccine introduction, but also potentially of issues that relate to the introduction to optimization of immunization schedules. So there are tools available. There is one which is called NVI-PST, which has been tested in a number of countries. There's another one which is called Capacity, which also has been used in countries. So there is some experience, and these tools are available. So that was discussed. Your next slide shows you some of the observations and conclusions from the discussion of SAGE. So it was clear that SAGE sees the need for this prioritization of new vaccine introductions. And we also, of course, acknowledge that SAGE provides a lot of product by product or recommendations, but at the end of the day, countries need to decide among and develop essentially their menu of vaccines they want to support in their country. It was clearly acknowledged that NITAGs have a critical role. NITAGs as structures that have the competency, that have established processes, that have management of conflict of interest and so forth, are probably ideal in order to run through such an MDCA approach with the engagement of the relevant stakeholders. And so absolutely a strong call from SAGE that NITAGs engage in this exercise, that there is the necessary support and training that is being made available. And it was, of course, noted that there's a strong linkage to the national immunization strategies, to which these processes should be tied, and also in terms of timing of these exercises. So that is on that topic. And so let's move on. I give you a very quick update on MPOX. So MPOX was a session which was for information, for discussion. It was not a recommendation session, but it was a session also to kind of flag the work ahead and also the data gaps that we have in order to expand our policy recommendations that for the time being are essentially exclusively focused on outbreak response. So you see here essentially a snapshot on reported cases. And so these are confirmed cases. Obviously today the epicenter of the MPOX epidemic is in the African region, while we have cases in all regions of the world, and also increasingly exported cases from this African outbreak, in particular this African clade 1b outbreak. So you see here the confirmed cases. As always, you have to see this with a grain of salt, because obviously confirmation and diagnostic rates vary in these places depending on the number of parameters. But you clearly see that we have very significant number of cases in DRC, in Uganda, in Burundi. It might be a little bit on the decline. And we not only have clade 1a, we obviously also have clade 1b, as you see here. Let's move on to the next slide. In response, obviously, vaccine rollout has started. Vaccine rollout is based for the time being on MVA-BN. There is also the LC16 vaccine, but it has been shipped in a small quantity to the DRC, but it hasn't been used yet. And there are some limitations in terms of their use, given the fact that it's a live attenuated vaccine. While the deployment of the vaccine initially started very slowly and was essentially focused on vaccination of contacts, also with a clear recognition that supply was limited and still is limited, there was recently an intensification, and particularly in DRC, and more particularly in Kinshasa, which you see here on the slide in terms of the administration of doses. You see here that there is a 2-dose regimen which is being used here. And the result of this intensification was unfortunately that we run quickly out of vaccine. So there is definitively a need to ensure continued supply for vaccination. The SAGE was presented, and I don't have a slide on this. SAGE was, we can go to the next one. SAGE was presented with mathematical modeling I have to say, preliminary mathematical modeling from Imperial College in terms of assessing impact of vaccination and different vaccination strategies using two prototype scenarios. One was a scenario of a more endemic type of transmission, so where, so to say, the zoonotic transmission, zoonotic spillover has been most prevalent, using data from the Equator province. And then another modeling exercise using which used data from South Kivu, looking in a context where there is much more person-to-person, a high proportion of sexual transmission. And the preliminary data suggests that different vaccination strategies have a different impact. Pediatric vaccination seems to be quite impactful in the case of endemic transmission, while really target a high-risk population vaccination, and in particular timely vaccination, seems to be more impactful in cases where you have predominantly human-to-human transmission. There was a strong call also from SAGE to again use the various off-label recommendations that we have published last year, which is the option of doing single dose vaccination with MVABN or also using intradermal fractional dosing in the situation of limited supply, which we are in at that point in time. Which we then discussed were data gaps and the need for establish recommendations for use of vaccine in a subsequent phase beyond the acute outbreak, with an effort to establish in select areas and select populations some degree of population immunity. So this is work ahead. We haven't done this yet. There is data needs, but this is the work I think which needs to happen and is becoming now quite urgent. Lastly, there was, and this relates back to the things that Anna said at the beginning and the regretful shortcomings of funding and discontinuation of certain programs. There's a risk that we'll see less uncontrolled HIV, and we know that in those individuals, we see in particular very severe disease emerging from mpox or also fatalities. So again, regretfully, a very problematic trend here. I think that's all from my side, and we go to Podio. So over to Rocio.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rithia Lopez. I'm from the Research Policy and Product Development team at WHO HQ, and I'll go over the SAGE discussions and recommendations for polio. Next slide, please.
I don't know if you can do anything about this, but you're relatively faint. I don't know if you can get a little bit closer to the microphone.
Okay, sure. I'll hover here closer. Hopefully that's
Thank you.
better. So there will be three parts to the slides that I'll present. So first will be a global update on the status of polio eradication, then an update on a bivalent oral poliovirus vaccine or BOPV cessation planning, as well as a proposed guidance for countries that are considering moving to IPV-only schedules ahead of that synchronized BOPV cessation. And then the last part looking at the immunogenicity of whole cell pertussis hexavalent vaccine and the programmatic and supply implications of including a booster dose of the vaccine into the schedule. Next slide, please. So first looking into a global map of WPV1 or wild poliovirus type 1 and circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus cases in 2024. To preface that poliovirus circulation, both of wild-type poliovirus and vaccine-derived poliovirus, continues to be declared a public health emergency of international concern since 2014, so it is over a decade now. So honing into the map, looking at the case and the environmental isolates from 2024. First looking in red are the isolates and cases for WPV1, and these are concentrated in the two remaining endemic countries in Afghanistan and Pakistan. As you can see that detections and transmission largely concentrated in the border between the two countries. Then looking at a vaccine-derived poliovirus in green primarily is the type 2 CVD-PV cases, and these are primarily concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa as well as a significant concentration in Yemen. There have also been detections in eastern portion of Indonesia, and then to note sort of recent detections in late 2024 and early 2025, sorry, in the European region of a transmission chain linked to Nigeria. Then for CVD-PV1, the transmission has reduced significantly. There have been cases reported from Eastern DRC and in Mozambique in 2024. And then finally for CVD-PV3, there have been environmental isolates in French Guiana in American region, as well as 3 paralytic cases in Guinea in 2024. Next slide, please. So now we'll take a closer look into WPV1 and then CVD-PV2 transmission specifically, as it is the primary burden of paralytic polio cases globally. So first here, looking at WPV1 cases in the 2 endemic countries in Afghanistan and Pakistan. On the top, as you can see, there was sort of a peak in transmission around 2019 and 2020, and then this has a decrease in the most recent years. However, in the latter part of 2024, there has been an intensification of transmission, particularly in Pakistan. And as you can see in the maps below, there's been sort of this intensification in transmission characterized by a reestablished transmission in historic reservoirs, as well as, again, that sort of intense transmission at the border between the 2 countries. And so this really highlights the importance of this ongoing cross-country collaboration to implement polio eradication program efforts. Next slide, please. Now looking at type 2 CVD-PV, to know that this continues to circulate, however, with a lower number of cases in 2024 compared to prior years. So the maps above these span from late and early 2024 in the left, then 2024 in the middle, and then late 2024 to present day on the right. And so as you can see, there's sort of a decrease in the reported cases and isolates of CVD-PV2. That graph on the bottom shows on the top sort of the AFP or paralytic clinical cases and environmental sample cases below. As you can see from a peak in 2022, there's a slow yet downward trend in CVD-PV2 isolates. And to quantify this, in 2024, there was around 260 paralytic cases of CVD-PV2 compared to nearly 400 cases in 2023, compared to nearly 700 in 2022. So again, this just really quantifies this downward, slow but downwards trend in CVD-PV2 cases. Next slide, please. So now moving into the next item that was discussed in SAGE, this is around BOPV cessation planning, which this has been ongoingly discussed in recent SAGE meetings in the past 2 years. And so just as a background, the globally synchronized cessation of bivalent OPV in routine immunization schedules is anticipated to be in 2030. Of course, this is contingent on a set of triggers and GPI strategy milestones that have been discussed and disseminated by SAGE in prior meetings. And so in this meeting specifically, it was discussed around the need for pre-cessation immunity boosting vaccination campaigns prior to cessation of BOPV. And this sort of comes from the lessons learned from the TOPV to BOPV switch back in 2016, and this sort of need of immunity boosting prior to cessation to try and avoid emergence and outbreaks of CVD-PV1 and 3 after cessation. So next, please. So how this was done is via modeling analyses in collaboration between WHO and a group in Imperial College London, as well as an Institute of Disease Modeling and Gates Foundation. And so these modeling analyses were done to determine sort of where, when, and how many pre-cessation SIAs are needed to be implemented. And this was based on one hand on a modeled risk of CVD-PV1 and 3 emergence, and then also on modeling sort of target population immunity, taking into account routine immunization as well as SIAs. Next, please. And so here the outcome of this exercise was a by-country risk tiering coupled with recommendations for the number and target of subnational or national vaccination campaigns. And to complement this, there were expert inputs incorporated into sort of the final classification of sort of how many and where. And so right now, where the exercise is seen for next steps is to engage with regions and member states to sort of further adjust the calculated need for pre-cessation SIAs by country to sort of take into account contextual or regional nuances. And so at present, what this exercise also served to do is to give a rough estimate on sort of vaccine needs for these pre-cessation campaigns, and it's essential to have this sort of anticipated communication with manufacturers to ensure that the vaccine supply is there to be able to conduct these immunity boosting campaigns. And so of the estimates that are here right now, it estimates approximately 1.7 billion doses of BOPV needed across 46 countries that have been modeled to benefit from these immunity boosting campaigns. Next slide, please. So the next part of BOPV cessation planning that was discussed by SAGE is sort of the anticipated transition of countries to IPV-only routine immunization schedules sort of ahead of the synchronized BOPV cessation. And so this was done between WHO and the Imperial College London to develop a three-part risk grading framework to assess country readiness to safely transition to an IPV-only routine immunization schedule. And so again, this was done sort of in response to different member states requesting guidance from WHO on sort of transitioning to IPV-only schedules. And so the aim of this exercise was for this to assist in national decision-making. And so to just go over the methods of this framework. So first, it was assessed sort of the adherence of member states to relevant SAGE recommendations. And so this includes, for example, a DTP3 coverage to be over 90%, the member state to have at least 3 IPV doses in the routine immunization schedules, and then also looking at the duration of for how long has the schedule included at least 2 doses of IPV into the routine immunization schedule. So this was sort of the absolute first filter applied to the risk rating framework. And then there were several variables that were taken into account to sort of risk tier countries by first population immunity in general, and then for polio specifically, taking into account both routine immunization and vaccine campaigns. Then looking at poliovirus transmission efficiency, this looked at under 5 mortality as a proxy indicator for this. Also looking at poliovirus importation risk, this looked at permanent migration patterns between WPV1 endemic countries as well as CVD-PV1 and 3 outbreak countries. Also looked at the risk of CVD-PV1 and 3 emergence as in the framework I mentioned in the earlier slide. And then finally looking at political fragility and civil conflict within the member state. And so all of these sort of risk factors and SAGE recommendations were brought together, and the output from this exercise was a by-country categorization of high, medium, or low readiness for a safe transition to an IPV-only routine immunization schedule. And so the next step would be to take this framework and engage with relevant regions and member states to sort of get feedback on this guidance, and those countries that were sort of determined to have high readiness to safely transition to an IPV-only routine immunization schedule. The next step would also be to do an evaluation of national poliovirus outbreak preparedness and response. And so this would entail to both assess ability of detection and then ability of response to potential post-transition outbreaks or importations. Next slide, please. And so the last portion that was discussed by SAGE was a revision of the hexavalent schedule as it pertains specifically for polio. So as a reminder, within the hexavalent vaccine, there's antigens for polio, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, type B influenza, and hepatitis B. Next, please. So this, again, will be specifically focusing in on the polio component of the hexavalent vaccine. So back in a couple of years ago, in 2021, SAGE recommended a 4-dose schedule when starting at an earlier schedule ahead of 8 weeks of age, or a 3-dose schedule when the first dose is given after 8 weeks of age. And so next, please. The SAGE in this latest meeting sort of did a revision to the schedule based on updated evidence on the immunogenicity of hexavalent vaccine. And there was also an analysis of sort of the cost and logistic and operational complexities of a 4-dose schedule. So all of these data were reviewed, and the main outputs were that in terms of immunogenicity, the evidence did show that seroconversion rates achieved with an early schedule starting at 6 weeks of age with only 3 doses did range from 92 to 98% across all 3 polio serotypes, and there was only a small incremental benefit for the first dose. And then also looking at programmatically and economically, SAGE recognized that it was challenging for many countries to implement a hexavalent vaccine schedule, which this would potentially be slowing the implementation and uptake of hexavalent. Next, please. And next, please, because I can summarize this in the last slide. So here are the SAGE recommendations on polio. So SAGE did express concern about the increasing number of WPV1 cases in Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as the continued transmission of CVD-PV2, and SAGE called for a transformative change in the eradication strategy, putting special focus on increasing routine immunization coverage. SAGE reiterated its support for safe cessation of BOPV and agreed with the plans for pre-cessation BOPV vaccine campaigns. SAGE endorsed the proposed risk grading framework as a guide for national decision-making for countries that are considering transitioning to an IPV-only routine immunization schedule ahead from the synchronized BOPV cessation, and urges WHO to initiate consultations on these topics with relevant regions and member states. And finally, as an output from my last slide on hexavalent vaccine, is that SAGE reviewed updated evidence and concluded that a schedule with a minimum of 3 doses of the hexavalent vaccine, starting even at an early schedule at 6 weeks of age, is adequate, and revised existing recommendations accordingly. And finally, just to really highlight that this recommendation does not change WHO's existing recommendations for providing booster doses of other antigens in the 2nd year of life. This was a focus for polio. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Rocio, Joaquim, and Hannah. We can stop now just a little bit for questions. If you have any question, you can write it in the chat, or you can also raise your hand, and we'll allow you to use your microphone. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Luis will give you the microphone, or write in the chat. I don't see any. I don't know, Luis, if you see any questions or raised hands.
No, I don't see any for now.
Okay. If not, well, we can continue, and you can write questions anytime. Oh, someone?
There is one for Rocio. What is the recommended age for the 3 doses of hexavalent?
Hello. So if you could go to the last slide, please. So here in the bottom rectangle, just to emphasize that when it pertains specifically for polio, that a minimum 3-dose schedule starting at any age, so even at an early schedule starting at 6 weeks of age, would be adequate. I hope this answers the question. Thank you.
Thanks. If anybody has any other questions, you can write it anytime in the chat, or raise your hand at the end. We'll have time for questions at the end again. So we will move on to the pneumococcal vaccine with Daniel. So go ahead, Daniel, please.
Hello, everybody. Just make sure you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
We can.
Yes. Great. Okay. Thank you. My name is Daniel Feiken. I'm in the Department of Immunization, Vaccine, and Biologicals at WHO. And I'm going to update you on the marathon session we had that took one entire day on pneumococcal vaccination. We're entering our 3rd decade of having pneumococcal conjugate vaccines, but there's still a lot to discuss. Next slide. This map shows you, as of 2023, which countries had national pneumococcal vaccine programs for children. In blue, 82% of member states, and you can see in yellow the countries that did not have national programs. And you'll note that there are several big countries that don't, particularly China, where there's only private market use of pneumococcal vaccines at about 20%. The other 2 countries I want to mention are India and Indonesia, 2 very large countries that did not start national programs until the last 5 years. And so they're still increasing coverage. In 2023, Indonesia had gotten up to 30%. But because of these big countries not vaccinating, and because some countries don't have high coverage of the third dose, next please. The global coverage for 3 doses is only 60. Next slide, please. There we go. So the global coverage for children with 3 doses of PCV is 63% in 2023, but we do expect that to continue to increase as countries increase their coverage. Next slide. So what does coverage look like for the 3rd dose of pneumococcal conjugate vaccine in Gavi-eligible countries? There's 2 3-dose schedules in use. One is called a 3+0, 3 primary doses and no booster. The other is 2+1, 2 primary doses and 1 booster. On the left, you can see most Gavi countries still use the 3+0 schedule. The red line is 80% coverage, and about half of these countries are above 80% coverage in WUNIC. On average, 77%. Some notable exceptions, you'll notice some of those bars are low, below 50% coverage of the 3rd dose. There are only 7 countries that use a 2+1 schedule in Gavi, and about 2/3 of them are above 80% coverage. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through the 5 policy issues that were discussed by SAGE. The first one is, what is the optimal 3-dose schedule? Is it 3+0 or 2+1? Next slide. In 2019, SAGE reviewed the PCV 3-dose schedules, and at the time, they felt that there was no evidence supporting one schedule versus the other. And so the recommendation was they could start using one or other of these 2 schedules as early as 6 weeks of age. Back in 2019, there were 2 pre-qualified pneumococcal conjugate vaccines. One by Pfizer had 13 serotypes included, and one by GSK had 10 serotypes included. So this time around, with 5 more years, SAGE reviewed all the accumulated evidence to see if now they could make a preferential recommendation for one of these 3-dose schedules. Next slide, please. And they reviewed lots of data. I'm just going to show you one result here. This is a meta-analysis that looked at pneumococcal pneumonia, comparing vaccinated and unvaccinated children. And at the top, you see 3 countries that use the 2+1 schedule. And at the bottom, 3 countries that use the 3+0 schedule. And if you look at that black diamond under each, that's the meta-analysis summary result. And you can see they're fairly close. They overlap, but there's really no difference. And in fact, all the outcomes that were looked at for these 2 schedules, all-cause pneumonia, radiologic pneumonia, vaccine-type carriage, PCV10, PCV13, there really was no outstanding difference in between the 2 schedules. The one area where there is a difference is if you look at just at the immunogenicity. So if you look at the level of antibodies, as one might expect, after the primary series, for some serotypes, there were higher levels after 3 doses than 2 doses. And then after the booster, it was the reverse. Those that got the +1 booster in the 2+1 schedule had higher antibody levels, but there was no clear difference in carriage or disease that could be noted between the 2 schedules. Next slide, please. One other thing that is new since 2019 is that there is a 3rd pre-qualified vaccine. It is another PCV10 product. It's made by Serum Institute of India. It's called Pneumosil. And there was evidence from 2 real-world settings about how this vaccine performs. On the left from India, you can see in a introduction in India in a 2+1 schedule. On the far left, there was a 38% reduction in vaccine type carriage. No difference in overall carriage. And on the right from Kenya switched, the whole country switched from the 10-valent GSK product to the 10-valent Pneumosil product. There are some slight differences in serotype, and it's less expensive. And in that red box at the bottom, you can see the rate ratios between the pneumocil period and the pre-PCV period. On the far right, 0.17 is the rate ratio. And then between the pneumocil period and the GSK period, 0.67. So reduction in both pneumocils seem to be effective in this setting in a 3+0 schedule. Next slide. So the SAGE recommendation about the 3-dose schedule was a reaffirmation that either schedule could be used and effectively control pneumococcal disease. All the evidence that was reviewed could not recommend one schedule preferentially over the other. Both can be used effectively. So a decision about which schedule to use should be based on epidemiologic and programmatic factors, such as what coverage can you achieve with that 3rd dose? What other vaccines are given at these different vaccination time points? And does it make sense to add on PCV then? The one area where a country might consider the 2+1 schedule preferentially is if they're having outbreaks in older children or disease in older children, because there, if you give that booster dose at 9 months or 12 months, you do get higher immune response into that second year of life. And then, as I mentioned, the PCV10 product from Serum Institute can also now be used in either schedule. Next slide. So let's move on to the second policy question. And this question was looking at the use of higher valency PCVs. These are vaccines that have more than 13 serotypes included. Next slide. This is a study called P-Serenade, and what it does is it looks at what serotypes are causing disease in countries that have been using vaccines with high coverage for 5 years. So mature pneumococcal vaccine programs, what's causing disease. At the top are PCV10 GSK using sites. At the bottom, PCV13 sites. The first thing I'll point out, hit return, please, is that serotype 19A, return. Next, thank you. Stop, okay. All right, serotype 19A, shown by the red arrow, causes about 1/3 of disease in the PCV10 sites, and that's because it's not included in GSK PCV10, and it had massive serotype replacement. But even in the PCV13 sites where 19A is included, it's still causing disease, 6.5%. So 19A is still an issue. Next, please. The other serotype included in both vaccines is serotype 3. It's hard to get rid of serotype 3. It has a thick capsule. Neither of these vaccines are very effective. Next, please. So what these higher valency vaccines include are some of these serotypes that follow after the ones I just mentioned. They're all causing about 2 to 5% of invasive disease. And many of them, as shown by the different colors, are included in these new vaccines. So the new vaccines are going for this next set of serotypes. Next, please. There are many, though, serotypes that are not included in these new vaccines because there are 100 serotypes for pneumococcus. It's expected that some of these may increase in prevalence, but these tend to be weaker serotypes. That's why they're not causing a whole lot of disease. So we'll see what will happen after these higher valency products start to be used more. Next, please. This shows you the pipeline for pneumococcal conjugate vaccines. As you can see, there are many in the pipeline. On the far right are the 3 that have been pre-qualified in red, and next to them are some other licensed vaccines that have not yet been pre-qualified. Many of them are only used in one country. And the one I'd like to point out to you is PCV14. This is made by a company called BioE in India. And I mention it because this one has been submitted for pre-qualification. So we may have a 4th pre-qualified vaccine. Next, please. Now, there is an issue with these higher valency vaccines, and it's something called immunogenicity creep. And what that means is as more serotypes are included in a vaccine, what happens is that the immune response to those shared serotypes, the ones that are in either PCV10 or 13, does go down a little bit. And you can see that on this graph. If you look at the top left graph, those blue dots represent each of the 13 serotypes that are in PCV13. They're also in a higher valency PCV20 product, also made by Pfizer. And what you can see is that all of them are to the left of that blue line. So they're not equivalent. They're lower in PCV20 than PCV13, but they're not low enough to be deemed inferior. So they're not to the left of that other dashed line at 0.5. So from an immunologic and a regulatory standpoint, they're non-inferior, and this led to licensure of PCV20. At the bottom, the yellow dots represent the new serotypes, the 7 new serotypes that are not in PCV13, and obviously most of these are higher because they're only in PCV20. The one thing to know about immunogenicity creep is it seems that the more serotypes you put in the conjugate vaccine, the more you're getting immunogenicity creep. So more with PCV20 than with PCV14. And this may be true going up as you get up into 20, 24, 25 serotypes. Next, please. The SAGE recommendation was noting that there are new higher valency products. As mentioned, BioE has been submitted, the PCV14 submitted for pre-qualification. All of these higher valency products have been and will be licensed strictly on immunogenicity, bridging studies, so non-equivalence. We don't know in the real world how they would look in terms of disease prevention, but it's thought based on their immune response that they will be effective. Immunogenicity creep is real, and we need to keep an eye on it. As I mentioned, it's not suspected that right now it would lead to an increase in disease, but surveillance is important. And that countries that are considering a switch to a higher valency product need to weigh the trade-offs. On the one hand, they will cover more serotypes. On the other hand, they may experience immunogenicity creep, and they need to keep an eye out for a reduction in control of pneumococcal disease to some extent. Next slide. There were 2 cost-saving alternative schedules that were evaluated by SAGE. And first, I'm going to talk about the 1+1 schedule, so 2 doses instead of 3, and then I'll talk about fractional doses. Next slide. There was lots of evidence that was evaluated about the 2-dose schedule, 1+1. There even is a country, the United Kingdom, that has switched their national program to a 1+1 schedule. And you can see the results on the left. You can see the annual incidence of invasive pneumococcal disease. The red line is children at the bottom. It's fairly low. They had good control of pneumococcal disease in children. They'd been using a 2+1 schedule with PCV13 for a number of years. And then in 2020, they switched to 1+1, and right away there was the pandemic. And all rates of pneumococcal disease went down with the pandemic because people were masking and keeping social distance. But after the restrictions were lifted in the UK, so if you look to the right of that shaded gray area, you'll see that the red line stays down. So there still was suppression of pneumococcal disease with that 1+1 schedule. There were several randomized studies that were done of the 1+1 schedule. On the right, I'm showing you the results from the largest one that took place in the Gambia. 40,000 children either got the 1+1 schedule or the standard schedule of 3+0. And what this shows you is looking at the outcome of radiologic pneumonia. So that's a consolidated pneumonia that's most often caused by pneumococcus. You can see the incidence rate in those 2 groups among children less than 5 is fairly similar, with a rate ratio of 1.07. And this is what was shown also for pneumonia that had vaccine type carriage in that study, no difference between the 2. And in fact, none of the randomized studies showed much of a difference between the 1+1 schedule and the pre-existing schedule. It should be noted that after that 1 primary dose, there is lower immunogenicity than 2 or 3 doses. it doesn't matter a whole lot if you've already had good control of pneumococcal disease by having a mature program using a 3-dose schedule. But it is something to watch. And there was a modeling study that showed that there might be a slight increase in carriage and disease from vaccine types over time from that lower immunogenicity after the first dose. But the magnitude was not thought to be great. And if the booster dose, that +1 dose, has high coverage, it should take care of it. So it's really imperative, if a country goes to a 1+1 schedule, that they get high coverage of that booster dose. Next slide. Next. Okay, there was one randomized study of a fractional dose. It took place in Kenya. And the way they did the study is they either used a full dose of PCV13 or PCV10 GSK, and they compared it with a 40% dose and a 20% dose. And at the top left, you can see with those purple dots that when they used a 40% dose of PCV13, that most of the serotypes had the same immunogenicity. Those dots fall on the 0 line. A few of them were slightly lower, but it was deemed to be non-inferior. However, with the 20% dose at the top right, some of those serotypes did drop off and they crossed that dashed line at -10. So it did not meet non-inferiority. And for GSK, neither of them met non-inferiority. So neither the 20% dose nor the 40% dose. And that's because the GSK vaccine has a lower concentration of the polysaccharide antigen for the serotype. So it would be expected that you might, when you start using fractional doses, not be as equivalent with that vaccine. But with the PCV13 at a 40% dose, it was deemed to be non-inferior based on immunogenicity data. Next slide. So to reduce costs, countries with a mature PCV program that have achieved adequate levels of herd immunity could consider one of these two cost-saving strategies, either the 1+1 schedule or the fractional dose. And the thought here is that if a country has good control of pneumococcal disease, and if they need to pay for their own vaccine, so for instance, if they are going to graduate from Gavi, they might consider, for example, a 1+1 schedule. So that means they'd be saving about 1/3 of the costs in vaccines because they're going from 3 doses to 2 doses. So this is something for countries to consider after they have a mature program. This is not, you would not start out in a country that's never had a pneumococcal vaccine with either of these programs. So what are the criteria countries should meet? They should have a mature program. They should have high coverage, 80% on average coverage for the last 5 years, or evidence from surveillance that they're not having vaccine type disease in their country, that it is well controlled. But it's important to monitor after a switch, and there needs to be plans in place if there is an increase in vaccine type disease to go back to that full dose, 3-dose schedule. Next, please. Last question that SAGE addressed was on campaigns to improve population immunity rapidly in settings that have low population immunity. We don't really think of pneumococcal vaccine as a campaign vaccine, but in certain settings, perhaps it would be. Next slide. The one study that was looked at, a randomized trial in Niger, in a setting that had moderate coverage, and multi-age cohort campaign was done. 1 dose was given to 1 to 9-year-olds at one point in time, either a full dose or a 20% fractional dose. The vaccine used was that PCV10 Pneumocil product that I mentioned from Serum Institute of India. And both of these strategies showed a reduction in vaccine type disease. The full dose more than a 20% dose, but the 20% dose was deemed to be non-inferior. So there did seem to be a reduction in carriage of the vaccine type disease in this population that should translate into a decrease in disease. There also was a model that was reviewed based on some data from Somaliland from a IDP camp. And that model showed that there would be a 33 to 45% reduction in carriage of vaccine types. However, after 3 to 5 years, if there's no follow-up campaign or if there's no routine immunization that's implemented, you would see vaccine type carriage go back up to baseline. So this is really a temporary measure to bring up population immunity quickly. This is not a long-term solution. Next. The recommendation from SAGE was that in a population that has reduced immunity, either high burden of disease or low vaccine coverage, or, for example, in a humanitarian emergency, a multi-age cohort campaign could be done with a single dose to rapidly achieve population immunity. The age range usually should be 6 weeks to 5 years, but if it's a setting that has outbreaks among older children, that age range could be expanded. SAGE did not feel that reactive campaigns to pneumococcal outbreaks were recommended, and that's because usually the response is too late. Really, only if the response can happen within the first 2 weeks of an outbreak with vaccine is it deemed worthwhile. Last slide, SAGE made some recommendations on surveillance. Surveillance is very important. Either doing serotype-specific disease surveillance or doing periodic surveys of nasopharyngeal carriage, looking at vaccine types. Either one of these strategies should be done to monitor changes in disease or carriage in the community after a new higher valency product is introduced, or if one of these alternative strategies, like the 1+1 schedule, is used. And SAGE recognized that every country might not have capacity to do surveillance, but because there's little data, real world data on these alternative strategies, it's important in the early adopter countries that they do gather some data, they monitor what happened, ideally in several WHO regions with different pneumococcal epidemiology. And this information from the real world experience will help other countries be able to make a decision to go forward with some of these strategies. So with that, I will end, and I don't know if there's any time for questions because I talked for a long time. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. We will have questions at the end. So we'll continue with the presentations with Melanie, who will present about varicella zoster-containing vaccines.
Thank you very much, Mario. My name is Melanie Marty, and I also work in the State Secretariat. Next slide, please. So I will familiarize you with the recommendations on that SAGE issued on varicella and herpes zoster. But before coming to that, maybe let me quickly outline a bit the background and specifically the epidemiology and the burden of varicella and herpes zoster. So primary infection results in varicella disease, which is commonly known as chickenpox, and the subsequent reactivation of the varicella virus in the neurons results in herpes zoster, also commonly known as shingles. Varicella is common in all countries, though the epidemiology does vary between temperate and tropical regions. So it needs to be pointed out that in tropical regions, the infection often occurs later in life with a higher susceptibility in adults and a higher risk of severe disease in in adults and older children. The annual incidence of varicella ranges from 300 to 1,300 per 100,000 population, with almost all people infected by adulthood. Between 1990 and 2021, the global age-standardized varicella and herpes zoster death rate declined by almost half, of 46%, to a rate of 0.19 deaths per 100,000. In 2021, varicella accounted for an estimated almost 14,000 deaths. The majority of these deaths did occur in children of 6 to 11 months of age. Next slide, please. So in terms of varicella vaccines, all of the currently available varicella vaccines are live attenuated vaccines. They are almost exclusively based on the Oka varicella vaccine strain, with the exception of one vaccine produced in South Korea, which uses the MAV strain. Varicella vaccines are available as monovalent vaccines or as combination vaccines with measles, mumps, and rubella. There are currently 4 pre-qualified monovalent vaccines, and none of the MMRV vaccines have been pre-qualified. The first national varicella program was introduced in the US in 1995. Since then, more than 44 countries have introduced the varicella vaccine as a national vaccine program for infants. Of these, 28 countries use a 2-dose schedule, and the rest uses a 1-dose schedule. The vaccine efficacy for 2 doses of MMRV is quite high, and it yields, even after 10 years, an efficacy of 99%. And for monovalent, the efficacy is equally high, of 90%. The pooled 1-dose vaccine effectiveness from a meta-analysis was 81% for all varicella and almost 100% against moderate and severe varicella. The median effectiveness of 1-dose against severe disease was 100%, and the pooled 2-dose vaccine effectiveness was 92%. Next slide, please. In terms of herpes zoster epidemiology, herpes zoster is a disease of older adults, and overall 95% of individuals aged 50 and over are seropositive for varicella and hence at the risk of developing herpes zoster. The incidence, as mentioned, increases with age, and a lifetime risk of developing herpes zoster in those who live up to 85 years of age is 50%. There are an estimated 15 million cases of herpes zoster globally in 2020 in the individuals over 50 years, and this is predicted to increase to 19 million cases by 2030. Post-herpetic neuralgia is one of the most feared common severe events following herpes zoster disease, and that occurs in 20% of patients with herpes zoster, and it's characterized by severe pain. And the frequency and severity of post-herpetic neuralgia increases also with age. Immunosuppression increases the risk of herpes zoster by at least tenfold. However, immunosuppressed people are only estimated to account for less than 10% of the burden of disease. Next slide, please. So talking a bit about herpes zoster vaccines, there's a adjuvanted subunit recombinant herpes zoster vaccine administered as a 2-dose schedule produced by GSK called Shingrix, and that was first licensed in 2017 for adults over 50 years of age and older, and in immunocompromised adults of 18 years and older. Previously, there was a live attenuated vaccine, Zostavax, produced by Merck, first licensed in 2006, also for use in immunocompetent adults over 50 years and older, but the manufacturer has now discontinued this vaccine. There are currently 2 other live attenuated vaccines licensed but used in domestic markets of few selected countries only. So the recommendations issued by SAGE really pertain to the recombinant zoster vaccine. Next slide, please. So on this recombinant zoster vaccine, the efficacy is very promising. The pivotal phase 3 clinical trials in 50 and 70-year-old individuals showed a high efficacy of 97% and 89%. The pooled efficacy were above 90% across different age groups. What is important to note that the efficacy is maintained throughout 11 years now in both age groups over 50 and over 70 years of age. In terms of real-world effectiveness data, that also was very high, albeit a bit lower than the efficacy, and ranged between 71% and 86%. Next slide. So summarizing the SAGE recommendations, on varicella, SAGE recommended that the use of varicella vaccines using a 2-dose schedule with a minimum of 4-week interval between the doses should be considered for the prevention of varicella in children in populations where varicella is an important public health problem. Countries introducing varicella vaccines should define vaccination coverage targets to avoid a theoretical risk of a shift in the age of infection that would result in a higher morbidity if the coverage is at low or modest levels. And introduction should be guided by national and subnational disease burden, by affordability and cost effectiveness considerations, but also by seroprevalence rates and the average age of infection. SAGE also recommended consideration of varicella vaccination in specific populations, such as in certain groups of immunocompromised at higher risk of severe disease, and those living with well-controlled HIV infection at adequate CD4 counts. SAGE also recommended to consider the vaccination of healthcare workers without those healthcare workers without evidence of prior documented varicella infection or vaccinations, particularly if they work with immunocompromised persons, to not transmit the virus onto these population groups, but also to protect themselves. So also when working with children, they should be considered for vaccination. In terms of the herpes zoster vaccines, it recommended that the use of the recombinant herpes zoster vaccine in a 2-dose schedule with a minimum of 2-month interval between the doses for the prevention of herpes zoster in older adults could be considered, including in those with chronic conditions and immunocompromised states. That said, vaccination should only be considered in countries where herpes zoster is an important public health problem, with due consideration to its cost effectiveness and affordability, in particular considering the very high price of the current product. With that, I conclude my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Melanie. We're going to continue with the last presentation with Luis, and then we'll take questions for everyone. So, Luis, on to you.
Louise, you are muted.
You're mute, please.
Oh, sorry. So I was saying in 2017, the progress of NITAGs were presented to SAGE, and this was a follow-up to the 2017 update. And thankfully, we were able to show the significant progress at global and regional levels. So we've moved from about 90 countries reporting a NITAG in 2010 to now 170 NITAGs, and of which 131 are considered fully functional, meaning they meet the 6 functionality criteria monitored annually on the GRF. However, you see on the right-hand side that we still need to continue our efforts to sustain over time and across regions the functionality of NITAGs, especially in the WIPRO region, where there are still countries without access to a NITAG, and this is mostly due to small countries. And WIPRO is currently looking at ways to establish a sub-regional NITAG for the Pacific Island countries. SAGE in 2017 recommended that NITAGs should go beyond the 6 functionality criteria and do assessment of their committees, either through external evaluation or a self-assessment. And WHO and partners have developed tools to do this evaluation, especially the NITAG maturity assessment tool, which was developed after the request of the GNN. So if you look at the map in blue, you see all the NITAGs that have done an evaluation using the NITAG maturity assessment tool, and that is 84 countries now, mostly in the PAO, EMRO, AFRO, and WIPRO region. In green are the countries that the NITAGs that have done an assessment using a different tool, and that's 21 NITAGs, mostly in CRO, because it was before the NITAG maturity assessment tool existed, and Euro. So we need to continue efforts to do assessment, especially in the WIPRO and Euro region. And again, the advice from SAGE was that the evaluation should not be a one-time activity, but should be regularly done. And with these evaluations, the NITAG should have a clear improvement plans that they need to roll out and monitor. Now, we aggregated the data of these evaluations done with the NMAT. So looking at AFRO, EMRO, PAO, and WIPRO NITAG evaluations, we didn't find any overall differences in the overall maturity across regions, but we did find differences in the overall maturity by income level. And if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, you see that the category that is lagging are the middle income NITAGs, with an overall maturity reaching 46 for the low middle income and 52 for the upper middle income NITAGs. The NITAG maturity assessment identifies several indicators, and of these indicators, the lowest performance is for independence and non-bias, where you have more than 70% of NITAGs that are meeting a basic level for independence and non-bias, followed by operations around 60%, and then stakeholder recognition. So these gives us clear guidance on where we should put our efforts to continue and strengthen the NITAGs. Again, these are also indicators that the NITAGs need to work on themselves, not necessarily through WHO and partners. We also conducted a survey on the NITAG Secretariat, looking at the structure, the funding, and the operations of the Secretariat. 84 NITAGs replied to our survey, and this is preliminary data that was presented to SAGE. We will draft a full report, and we will present that to the GNN. If you look at the graph on the left-hand side, you see the funding source, and you see the huge difference between income levels. So the Secretariat is more likely to be funded by domestic funding only if it is in a high-income country, whereas if it is in a low-income country, it would be both domestic and external funding. And you see to move from domestic funding external to domestic funding only, there is a huge gap between the lower middle income to the upper middle income. Now, looking at the right-hand side, more worryingly, you see that 46% of the NITAGs that replied are relying on less than one staff full-time for the Secretariat. And this has consequences on the ability of the Secretariat to use a recommendation framework. And again, you see that the category that is lagging in the ability to use a recommendation framework is the upper middle income country, where only 40% of the NITAGs are able to use a recommendation framework. This can be the evidence to recommendation framework or another adapted framework. So we also presented what we see as the perspectives for NITAGs in the years to come. We've seen that the NITAG mandate has already expanded. So the scope of work of NITAGs are not only on childhood vaccination anymore, but the NITAGs are really looking at life course vaccination. They have also broadened the mandate to not only do a new vaccine introduction, but look at monitoring the coverage, evaluating the program performance, giving advice on optimizing vaccine use. They have also integrated key considerations like economic and equity considerations in the evidence review process. But more needs and can be done through the NITAGs, especially with the NITAGs playing a greater role in the development of the NIS. Also providing recommendations on what vaccines to prioritize. using a multi-criteria decision analysis approach. And that was referred to by Joachim at the start of this webinar. And the NITAGs are also advising on more and more complex immunization-related issues such as vaccine hesitancy, low vaccine uptake, and pandemic preparedness. So with this expansion of the mandate, we see a need for the NITAGs to continue to be trained. And this is something that we also presented. So far, most of the NITAGs have been trained on in person through multi-cohort workshops, choosing a policy questions that they were currently working on, and also adding to these workshops some vaccinology concepts. We've also encouraged NITAG members to apply to vaccinology courses. But we need now, with the current context, to move to more virtual training and ensure that these trainings would include all of the new roles that we see for the NITAGs. I don't know why the curriculum is not full. But this learning journey that we're currently developing would be a 10-week course addressing different topics over 10 weeks, and it would include the self-paced courses and facilitated discussion. There would be a cohort in the morning to accommodate the Western Pacific time zone, and then afternoon cohort. And we would roll out this learning journey 3 to 4 times a year. And we hopefully want to start this journey in October. So this, again, I will share more as we develop the learning journey. So SAGE encouraged the efforts to sustain and further enhance the capacity of NITAGs through trainings and advocated for periodic evaluations of their capacity and functioning. So this is re-emphasizing what was said in 2017. They also reiterated the need for sub-regional immunization technical advisory groups to serve countries with small populations. So it was addressed in the Caribbean, and it is yet to be done in the Pacific Island countries. SAGE also called for countries to demonstrate their commitment to NITAGs by increasing domestic funding, and this is quite urgent in the current context, and also enacting legislation that recognizes the role and importance and functionality of NITAGs. And then at long last, SAGE applauded the strong coordination of NITAG support through the Global NITAG Network and called WHO and partners to continue supporting this initiative. And this is my last slide. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Luis. We are very excited with the development of NITAGs, and we have high hopes on what's coming. So if you have any questions, you can send them by chat or raise your hands, and we have a few minutes for questions. I don't see any questions. Luis, do you see any?
I think most of the the questions were addressed. Maybe if Melanie is still here, I think this was for Melanie or for Danny. Is it recommended to provide laboratory evidence of immunity before vaccination of health workers?
Thanks, Louise. I think that was related to varicella, and I had answered, but I mean, just to outline, I mean, the background is whether the healthcare workers need to present with lab documentation of previous infection or vaccination. And SAGE had looked into these data and found that the self-reported history of varicella is generally not a very good and reliable indicator for immunity. Hence, SAGE really stressed the importance to have a clearly documented history of either vaccination or past infection.
Okay, there is one question for me on, thank you, Melanie, for the online learning journey. So there will be the way that we are envisaging rolling this out is there will be a call for application. This call for application will be sent through the GNN mailing list and through WHO regional offices. People can apply. There is no limits in the number of people applying per country, so everyone can apply. And then we would identify the people who are accepted in the first cohort. So remember that it will be up to 15 per cohort, one cohort in the morning, one cohort in the afternoon. So it's people who are able to commit for the 10-week course. They can skip 2 weeks. And if they're unable to attend the facilitated discussion in the morning, they can attend the one in the afternoon and vice versa. But there will be no limit in the ability to apply. The issue is that because we want to use this opportunity to train and also to do some networking, that's why we're limited to 15 per cohort, but we will roll it out 4 times a year. So Camila, I will provide more information on the course once we have designed it. I will present it to the GNN. I want also the GNN to give advice on whether the curriculum as it stands is the right, if we've captured all you need in the journey. And I will also call for application for a pilot. So if some people are interested in piloting this course with us, we would be more than happy to roll it out with a pilot cohort. So again, I will share that. There was, if Danny is still here, there is one last question on PCV. In which cases would you recommend switching from PCV 13 to a higher valency PCV in children and older adults? Danny is no longer here, so Joachim, are you able to answer?
Well, I think what you would like to have is some evidence that indeed the serotype, the additional serotypes in the higher valency products actually pose a significant problem in your country. So that could potentially be a justification. Danny pointed to the other considerations. Obviously, this product come at increased cost, and potentially the protection against the types that are in the lower valency vaccines already could potentially be somewhat lower, but that is currently a hypothesis. So I think it's mostly a consideration in terms of understanding your burden of disease, whether these additional types make a difference. And then you need to look at your cost effectiveness.
Thank you, Mario. I don't see any more questions, and we've reached the hour.
Okay, so I want to thank everybody, especially everybody who presented in this meeting. It's not easy to digest everything that SAGE presents, and it was a lot of really important information. And I think this type of video really helps us to bring this to our countries and to our NITAGs. So with that, I think it's we can finish this this webinar, and we'll see you again really soon. Thanks, Luis, for everything.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.